Hello everyone and welcome back. We are getting started on a brand new unit today. We are taking a look at the early republic. So at the time period we are picking up, the revolution is actually still going on, but we are about to secure our independence. And then comes the fun part, getting to decide how your government should look and how it should be set up. So a big part of this unit is going to be about the U.S. Constitution. Now, before we get to the Constitution, there were some bumps in the road, and they'd experimented with a few idealistic forms of government, and namely the Articles of Confederation. That's what we're going to take a look at today, and we're going to look at the structure of the Articles, how it was set up, and ultimately some problems that led to its downfall. So go ahead and get your notes ready, and let me get the presentation started up here. So here we go. Unit 3, I think we're actually on Unit 4, so already I got an error. So it goes. Here we go. So the introduction, just very briefly, just a reminder, kind of the mindset of the colonists at the time. We always talk about the taxation piece, and taxation is going to be a big part of what we talk about today because, yes, they're angry over taxation, but remember, they were more angry about the lack of representation, right? No taxation without representation. They feel as if they can only be taxed by people that represent them in government. So that's ultimately going to be the goal, is setting up some kind of representation that truly reflects the desires and will of the people. They did not have that under the British system. So that is the ultimate goal. And like I said, the articles that they set up are going to be very idealistic because, they're coming out of this conflict, where actually at the time they're writing it, they're in the conflict. In fact, they would be for another 5 years. But remember, this conflict ultimately kind of became about, a tyrant king, or at least that's how they framed it, a tyrant king thousands of miles away. So, the centralized figure, that is going to be a big issue for these early colonists, is that they're so far removed from government. They're going to do everything in their power to make sure that what they create is not another distant centralized power. And remember that, we're talking about establishing a government that is going to adhere to everyone from Vermont all the way down to Georgia. That is a pretty big distance. So, don't think of it like today where you jump on a plane and an hour later, you're halfway across the country. For people between that span of distance, a federalized government that we'll get to, it would have been unheard of. That would have been so far removed from what they actually wanted at the time that people would have thought it was ridiculous. So the Constitution, as it is set up today and will be set up in 1789, is so far removed from what the people actually wanted at this time. But they're going to go through some growing pains and realize that perhaps what they want and what they need are two different things. So let's take a look at the Articles of Confederation. Just a couple dates here. November 1777, the articles would be approved and they would be submitted then to the states. Each state would have to look at it. The ratification process did not take place until 1781. Remember, the American Revolution's going on during this entire time. So, we're seeing years of fighting going on. At the same time, they're trying to set up this government. The fighting really would last until 1782. So anyways, we're during this entire approval process, they are still fighting off the British to secure their independence. Let's take a look at the structure of the Articles of Confederation. And by the way, I know we just recently did a kind of a crash course on American government, and you might be saying, well, I've already learned this. We're going to go into much more detail here than we did before. So please, hopefully you gain kind of a basic understanding of things like the Articles and the Constitution in our crash course. But here we're going to be going into a lot more detail, so make sure you are paying attention. All right, so the structure of this. First of all, let's define what Confederation actually means. A firm league of friendship for the common defense, the security of their liberties, and their mutual and general welfare. That is one of the first lines in the Articles, and really defines what it means. So this is not something that states were they were not giving up necessarily their liberties to join in this group. This was a league of friendship. Doesn't that sound nice? So Article 3 of the Articles is what defines that. It goes on to say that there would be a Congress, there would be kind of a legislative body. I'll talk a little bit later. I'm going to try not to highlight all the problems as we go through, because the next slide we'll talk about the problems, and there were many. But it's going to be hard for me to just talk about the actual structure itself right now. The unicameral Congress. So we talked in our crash course about being a bicameral Congress, how we, in the Constitution, it's set up to where we have two houses of Congress. Well, the article set up one house of Congress, and so a big difference from what would come later on. Each state that participated would have a singular vote, okay, regardless of size. Each state would have an equal vote. Each state could send somewhere between 2 and 7 delegates to represent their state. They were chosen from the state legislatures themselves, so the state government selected 2 to 7 individuals and sent them for 1-year terms. They could not serve more than 3 years in any 6-year period. So, this was one problem that they saw, was that, there were these lifelong politicians, and I think most people could probably argue that that's one of our issues today, but they go the exact opposite way, and they have it to where hardly anybody in this Congress is going to have a lot of experience, and they know that their time is not only valuable, but they're going to push to get a lot of stuff done. And probably the only thing worse than not getting a lot of laws passed, like we often get frustrated with our Congress today, probably the only thing that's worse than that is getting a lot of laws passed. And we'll see the effects of that here soon. The Congress itself, this unicameral Congress, would have jurisdiction over foreign relations. Remember, they're in this war with Great Britain. They do need a body that will represent this system in not only making peace with the British, but perhaps making treaty alliances with the French and just all nations. So this body did have the authority to make treaties and alliances, and they could make war and peace. You needed 9 of the 13 in order to declare war and to make peace. So that's quite a bit. That's going to be a hard number to get. Most people are going to be split on issues, but 9 out of 13 states really to get much done. Other issues, they could maintain an army and a navy. I really want to talk about the problem of that here, but I will not. They also could coin and borrow money. Again, on a nationwide system, they will not do that, but they did have the power to do that. Each state's going to basically continue to do their own thing here. They could establish a postal service, manage Indian affairs, and we often fail to mention the native peoples that are, of course, still present not only in these states, but are vastly present in the area that America will soon take over, and that is kind of the British territory. Basically all the land from the 13 states over to the Mississippi River. And, at the end of the war, we gained that territory from Britain, and part of what we had to deal with was, making sure that the tribes were, basically... I'm trying to present it in a positive light, but obviously there would be there's going to be a lot of conflict with Native Americans, and a lot of treaties signed with them in which the U.S. government violates those treaties, and that, frankly, is still going on today. But that's another lecture for another time. This body also had the ability to settle disputes between states. They were kind of the last line to settle any of disputes. Now, there was not necessarily they had a president. Now, I'm going to talk about kind of the executive. It's not even, I would say, a full branch. There was a president, but it's not necessarily the president and the job that we would see listed and created under the Constitution, okay? So kind of separate it out in your mind. But there was a president, kind of one person that served as kind of the head of the executive, which was called the Committee of the States. And it was basically one delegate per state with one person to serve as president for 1 year. really there's no executive. I mean, there's no one to actually carry out the laws, and this is perhaps the biggest failure of the Articles, is that they're so afraid of the tyranny of a singular individual with a lot of power that they don't give anyone power, and there needs to be a balance. So again, I promised you I wouldn't talk about the problems. We'll get there eventually. So there's really no executive. There's really no judicial as a part of this federal. But I shouldn't say federal. It's not a federal system. It's a league of friendship, kind of a unified grouping. There is no national government. I want you to kind of understand that is basically the state governments coming together in a few areas, for mutual protection and things like that. Any amendments to this Constitution, and man, this is another tough one, tough pill to swallow as to how they thought this would be a good idea. Any amendments had to require unanimous decision. I don't know whether you've been in a group, just even in a car full of your friends trying to decide where to eat dinner. It's never unanimous, right? I mean, imagine now we're talking political decisions that are going to affect thousands and thousands of people. It's hard to get a unanimous decision, but they did decide that would be best. They didn't want it changed a lot, and I think there's some importance we need to place there. Now, lastly, and I think this is a very interesting point, they did offer, they offered an invitation to Canada. They sent an invitation to Canada to join this Article of Confederation as a colony of the British. If they wanted to join, then 9 states would have to approve that. Now, ultimately, Canada has a pretty good deal, and we talked about that in our American Revolution unit. Canada has pretty much all the rights and privileges that they desire without any of the taxes that we were being forced to pay. They got a good deal, and they're not going to throw that all away to join our ragtag group. So anyways, and plus they might still be bitter of the fact that we just invaded them a couple times. But anyways, moving on. All right, to the problems, and you will see these listed when you read Federalist number 15, the insufficiency of the present Confederation to preserve the Union. This really outlines all these in quite solid detail. So I'm just going to kind of talk about some of the big topics included in the Federalist number 15. So, of course, the first and perhaps the greatest failure of the Articles is there is no power of taxation. They were so bitter about these taxes that had kind of gotten the whole thing started with the Revolution that they did not give this assembly, this government under the Articles, the power to tax. And again, you've gone from one extreme where they felt like they were being taxed too much to the other extreme where they're not taxing at all. They can't. They don't have the power to do that. It was still left up to the states. That's a problem because that means that basically states are going to have to donate money in order for this government to actually work. How often do you think that's going to really happen? And the answer is never. So basically that meant that the government could make decisions, they could pass laws, but they couldn't enforce them. There's no way to enforce them. You can't pay a military, you can't pay, a police force, you can't pay an executive branch to execute the laws. There's no way to actually enforce what they're doing. And so, again, taxation, this was an idealistic addition to the Articles, but ultimately it is one of the biggest reasons that it failed. I mentioned the military being used to enforce, or lack thereof, the laws coming out of the Articles. There was no money, so you can't have a military if there's no money. Most people don't just volunteer and go without pay at all. So there's no military, and this made it very difficult to conduct foreign policy, and frankly, it'd be impossible. Economics. Each state still had the ability to create its own currency, and most states were kind of leery of this new government, and so they just kept making their own currency. Well, that makes it hard to trade in between states, and there needed to be a kind of a unified currency between all of these states, but that would not come actually for a long time. But each state was still coining their own money, and then you got into issues of, well, how does this how does this actually transfer? What is one Connecticut dollar versus one Vermont dollar? So economics, it really just complicates issues in trade, in commerce, and makes things difficult. So again, no state was forced to compelled to do anything to help out the other. So there's really kind of a standstill in economics between the states and trade. The fourth issue, enforcement. Without that central body of that executive, there was no enforcement. No state had to really comply with another state or the articles themselves. There's nothing that they knew that. If the articles passed, if the Congress passed, some kind of law, they didn't have to follow it, and they knew that. So again, you have a government that can pass things, but is completely toothless in how they're able to enforce them. Very difficult to pass resolutions knowing that they wouldn't be followed by certain states. And then finally, issues of sovereignty. Each state, according to the articles, this is a direct quote, retained its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. That's a good thing for the states, but ultimately that would set up a lot of clashes into the future. There's no uniformity of laws. Laws are very different from state to state, and frankly, this would lead to a lack of respect throughout the world because they're really countries didn't really know who to talk to. Do you go to the representative from Virginia or the representative from this Confederate Congress? So, who is in charge? How do we really uphold treaties? It led to issues of confusion. There needed to be a centralized body in order to handle those affairs, but instead leaving it to each state basically led to a lot of clashes in the future. All right, let's get to some of the things that actually did work. There were some positives that came out of the articles, things that they were able to get done. And specifically, I want to talk about the Land Ordinance of 1785. This was a law passed by the Congress of the Confederation that set up former British territory to sell off to settlers. So I just mentioned that all the land from the 13 colonies to the Mississippi River is now up for grabs. The governments here, the Confederation is selling off this land to raise money. Remember, they can't tax, so the only way to actually make money is really through this, is selling off land, and that's a pretty finite resource. So you might want to make sure that you're getting top dollar for it. So anyways, this Land Ordinance of 1785 served a couple purposes. Number one, it did hope to raise money for this new government so they could actually function, okay? The second is a survey system. Now, I want to add, Thomas Jefferson's role in all of this. By this point, Thomas Jefferson he is still in the United States. When we get to the Constitution later on down the road, he will actually be gone. He will serve as ambassador to France during that period. But right now, right here, Jefferson is very influential in what is being created, and I'm thankful for that because I think Jefferson had some high ideals that, frankly, set us on a course towards stronger democracy in our early republic. Even though he had many flaws, and we'll talk about a lot of those flaws. And he was a slave owner, and that needs to be recognized as well. He talks a lot about liberty, but then goes home to where he has people in chains. I mean, that kind of hypocrisy is abundant in this early period, and we need to recognize that. And that's a very difficult pill to swallow. But there still were some good things that were set up, even by people that were doing horrible things at home. The survey system, and this is just kind of how they set up all this land. Think about it logistically. How do you sell off new land to people? Well, you got to divide it. You got to organize it in a certain way. So what they came up with was a survey system, and frankly, this explains how our towns are set up even today. You'll notice that a lot of our towns are set up in these plots. But what they did was they divided 6 square miles into townships. And these townships could further divide into 36 lots. And those lots, most of them were 1 square mile per lot. So, this basically set up a system. You could buy one, you could buy multiple lots. What's interesting about this is that Thomas Jefferson had included in this land ordinance that in every single one of these townships, there would be space, usually in the middle, reserved for two items. Number one, for schools. Okay? Every township had land set aside for public schooling. Number two, there was also land set aside for a local government. Okay? Now, both of those things are very important because I think we often have lost sight in our democracy that that number one, we need to have a voice in our democracy, and by setting aside land for local governments to be able to act. You can go to your local government and you can have a say. That this land ordinance basically set it up to where each and every township the people living there would have the ability to reasonably travel a small distance to have their voice heard. That is democracy, through and through, to have your voice heard by government officials. The school system as well. The school systems would be left up to the states, but what this ensured was that each township would have a school and that at least have space for a school. We have, from the very beginning of our country, understood and believed that it is in the best interest of our society for people to have a basic level of education, at least a basic level of education. And sometimes I see this attacked, even today, that, public schools, and there are many faults, there are many failures of public schools, and no one denies that. But at the root of it, the purpose of the public school system is to provide a basic level of education for all of society. So that way we do not dive further into ignorance. Now, like I said, my purpose of this lecture is not to get into all the issues of the public school system, but that is another part of democracy, is being an informed public and being able to actually understand how to become informed and how to think. Jefferson understood that and built it in to how the West would be settled. Democracy is at the heart of settling the West here, and I think we need to understand that we've lost sight of that. We've got this distance between us and our government. We've got this denial that public schools actually serve any benefit. I'll tell you, right here, I'm passionate about this subject because you want to understand. We often go back. What do the founders think? What do they? Well, this is what they thought. They thought that it was in the best interests. And the public's paying for that. This is not private schools being set up here. The public's paying for that basic level of education. So, you know what the founders thought? They thought everybody should be educated, and that public should help chip in for that. Moving on to that Jefferson's abolition proposal. Now, like I said, Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner. He had a very large plantation in Virginia, and we do have to understand that he had a major voice early on. Was one of the founding leaders of this country, and could have done more to stop slavery, and frankly should have done more. But we talked in that in one of our previous units about the southern states really holding on to slavery and not wanting to compromise if it was going to affect slavery at all. And even though Jefferson himself is a Southerner, he's from Virginia, that is a southern state considered at the time, they were unwilling to do anything that might risk slavery in those southern states. So when they're going to pass the Constitution, that's a major moment. When they're passing this articles, that's a major thing that's being discussed, and Southerners will not allow slavery to be attacked. But here's what's interesting, is that in this land ordinance, Thomas Jefferson is able to push this proposal through, that all of the land that in new states being founded after the year 1800, that they would be free states. This is a major moment because, and I'm going to come back to this, Because when the Civil War rolls around, you're going to have a lot of inaccurate statements saying that the Founding Fathers believe that you have the right to own slaves. And that's a very debatable topic. But I think with this example right here, I think we see that the Founding Fathers did believe there were limitations to those. And I've talked about this before. None of the rights that we have are absolute. You do not have the absolute right of freedom of speech. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater, right? You can't say whatever you want. You can't spout hate speech that sparks, a riot. That is against the law. Okay? Same thing here. At the time, you did have the right to own a slave, but they are putting limitations on it. They're saying that, where you are in those southern states, yeah, you can keep your slaves, but in this new land, there will not be slavery. So they are limiting the spread of slavery, and that is so important to understand that there were limitations to it. It was not an absolute right to own slaves, and the founders agreed to that in this law. So anyways, this the proposals that Jefferson is including here, not only for the school system, but also the abolition proposal, that is a very important point. Now, I will say that this only partly passes. Because in this land ordinance of 1785, this abolition proposal is actually fought down. And we're going to talk within a couple years here that they would get a proposal to abolish slavery in this area passed. Right here, it does not happen. Okay, but understand that they were debating this, and it was desired even by some Southerners like Jefferson. The school system is accepted, okay, to where they would reserve land for schools, for government, and like I said, that really is going to help democratize the West as we start to move westward and become further and further distant from population centers. It means that people are going to have a say in their government, and they're going to be able to pass laws that affect them and have a say in that. So the abolition proposal, perhaps I wasn't clear, because the abolition proposal is shot down here, but understand that they were debating it, and the reason I guess I'm so adamant, I really should kind of pass the next law that comes into effect is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So just to avoid confusion, what they were setting up in the last slide was kind of how to organize this territory. But then a law officially passed, 1787, which organized this into 5 official territories that ultimately would become 6 states: Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin. Now, the first thing is that it does forbade slavery, which is huge. There is a limitation to it, and this would be something that those in the antebellum period would point to. Our founding fathers did think there should be limitations on slavery, so any argument against that would be incorrect. It does apply the township principle that Jefferson has proposed, to where you would have these lots decided of square miles that people could buy. Ultimately, they were selling about 1.5 million acres, and they were supposed to sell them at $1 per acre. That was the original proposal. They ended up selling them for about 10 cents an acre. So, the government is going to make less money, but there was a stronger desire to extend west, and they're trying to appeal to people. They didn't want to make it so expensive that no one moved west. They want this territory utilized. They know that ultimately that's going to make this nation stronger, is if this new territory is actually utilized. It also, the Northwest Ordinance also defined how the governments would be set up. And basically, when a population would reach 5,000 free males, and free males, okay, so not including women, not including slaves, not including anyone else, children, free males, they could elect a territorial legislature. And at 60,000 people, they could apply for statehood. So if at that point, if they applied to statehood, it would go to Congress, and if they approved the state constitution, it was admitted into the Union of States. So again, that territorial organization, we're seeing it really come into fruition by 1787. And the Northwest Ordinance. And I should mention, that government, it's looking more and more like what we would have in the Constitution. There's a governor. That governor would have veto power over the legislature. So the Northwest Ordinance, a major moment and one that's going to continually be looked at by future generations to try and understand exactly how the founders intended the spread or the limitation of slavery. Okay, our last look here is going to be at state politics and what is happening under the Articles. And this is really where the failure belongs, because state governments were becoming much more corrupt. It was believed early on that they would operate, of course, what was for the public good. But by this point, and by the way, recognize what is happening here, because this attempt at a republic is, it is the largest republic that's ever existed in the history of mankind. It's not an easy thing to do, to have people set up their government and just act as if they're going to do what's in the best interest of everybody all the time. Human nature, greed is a part of human nature, and that would have to be stifled for the public interest at some point. But early on, it did fall to corrupt hands. There was a lot of opportunity with these new governments, and people took advantage of that. Lawmaking becomes very chaotic. We talked about how the representatives for each state in this Congress of the Confederation, they only served for basically 1-year terms. Well, what that meant was when they got in there, they tried to pass as many bills as they could. And, it was really happening at the state level too, where they were getting elected and then they were trying to get as much done as they could in their short amount of time. And what that meant was that high turnover rate meant that a lot of laws were getting passed. And I put down Madison there. James Madison actually wrote later in his life that he said more laws were passed in the decade following independence than during the entire colonial period. And again, the only thing more chaotic than not passing laws is passing a lot of laws. So this was not necessarily a good thing. Ultimately, and I emboldened this with some asterisks there, the experiment of republicanism was failing. We had 13 corrupt state governments, and we had a toothless nation in whole, and it was not going well. And so there needed to be another plan. Frankly, a new constitution was going to be needed. By the 10 years that the Articles was in effect, they realized it was failing. It was not working, and that America would descend into chaos. And frankly, it was going to turn into, the new world would turn into the old world pretty quickly, in which nations like France and Germany and, Britain, I guess there's no Germany by this point, but Britain and France, they were constantly fighting, right? Or constantly at war. They didn't want that to develop here. We didn't want, Virginia and Maryland to constantly be at war with one another. So a new constitution was needed. There was some major unrest going on. In 1787, there was a full rebellion. A man named Daniel Shea, he would lead 1,200 farmers to protest taxation. In western Massachusetts, which at the time was considered really the frontier. I mean, it's a very rural area, at least. Perhaps not the full frontier, but anyways, a very rural area. And Daniel Shea led a group of mainly veterans. These guys were mainly veterans who had received farmland as a part of their pension after the American Revolution. Many of them were starting to lose their farmland because they could not afford to pay taxes on it. Massachusetts had passed taxes on farmers, and which most people were farmers at the time. And most of these guys had lost their farms because of taxation. And they're saying, listen, we just fought. We literally fought, and some people gave up limbs and other lives to stop overbearing taxation from King George, how is this any better? Now we've lost our livelihood. And so ultimately, this rebellion, it does look as if it is threatening the entire system. Daniel Shea is going to, threaten the entire state government, but, this could have spread quite rapidly. The hero of the day once again emerges, George Washington, who by this point has believed to be retired, gone out of the public eye somewhat. He is going to return, and he shows up basically on horseback. And man, if you're Daniel Shea, if you're some of these farmers, when your old general returns and tells you basically to turn around, that this rebellion is to be put down, you listen. But this is a moment in American history to where we were really on the precipice of chaos and anarchy. And I think Washington understood that. I think what he saw with Shea's rebellion is going to push him to take on the role of president later. But man, it looks pretty chaotic at this point. So by 1787, they're realizing we're going to have to come up with a new system, and they meet in 1786, they actually decide to meet. I've gone a little bit chronological out of order here. They decide to meet in Annapolis, Maryland, and the delegation really. The whole purpose was about trade. They were talking about how can reform, various laws about trade. Ultimately, there was a major lack of participation. Only 5 states sent delegates, and the meeting itself was kind of a failure, but they decided to reconvene in Philadelphia. It was just kind of symbolic of the whole situation that nobody showed up here. This Confederation, this League of Friendship, it was not too friendly anymore. And they realized if we want to have a functioning country, then we need to address some of these bigger issues. So they decided to get together in Philadelphia in May of 1787. And that will become known as the Constitutional Convention, and that will be the topic for our next lecture. Thank you so much for paying attention, and please at any point shoot me an email if you have any questions. I'll be happy to clear anything up for you. Thanks.